Hi, I'm Ashley. Today I'm going to be doing a line and wash watercolor portrait. I've been doing a lot of sketches and a few watercolor paintings of my kids, but I decided that today I would do a watercolor portrait of my husband and I on our wedding day. So I did this sketch actually while I was at a conference. So I was in one of the education sessions just sketching, and I was pretty happy with how it turned out. I went over it in the Sharpie and I think I captured a lot of good detail. So today I'm just going to be doing the watercolor washes over it and trying to make it just colorful and vibrant and really capture the feel of our wedding day. I start by picking the brushes that I think that I'll use in this painting. So these are the Princeton Select brushes and my Dugato round brushes. I got both of those sets on Amazon. And then I just wake up my paints. This is a travel pan that I filled with Winsor & Newton Cotman tubes. And then I also have these metallic watercolors. And I got really everything on Amazon actually. So everything is linked into the description. You can find it there. You can find these items elsewhere as well, but Amazon's just very convenient. So that's what I use. So I start with the metallics. My dress was a champagne color, so it wasn't white, and it did have kind of a shimmer or shine to it. So I went ahead and used the metallics to make that stand out against the white paper, and I just wanted to show that it's not quite white, and again, just kind of get some of that shine in there. So I'm just kind of carefully filling in, basically, paint by numbers at this point, for the metallic. I really just didn't want to get the metallic really outside the lines because it would have been very obvious just because it is so shiny. So when the light hits it, it's very, very obvious. So just trying to make sure that I kept that paint contained within where my dress is drawn. And then I let it dry, and I just added some gray to where the shadows on the dress would be. So kind of where I had drawn those lines to indicate the folds in the dress, I added just a little bit of the gray, and this is wet on dry at this point, so it's not going to bleed out much. And then just kind of under my arm and in the front, where the shadows would be. And then I added a little bit of that gray color on the edge where it was kind of scalloped, so there was a little bit of a shadow kind of under that edge. After I did the dress and let it dry, I mixed up some skin tones, and I started with a really light wash and just did my skin tone first, and I kind of went in a little bit darker after that with some kind of different shadow colors. I added a little bit of purple to it to get a cooler shadow color where the light was not hitting my skin. And I also, through this, was constantly reminding myself that watercolor dries lighter, number one, and so it wasn't going to look too harsh or too dark because I'm pretty pale. And I also remind myself that the background of this painting is all currently white, so any color at all is going to really show up and stand out at this point until I add in some of those darker values to contrast it. So after I did my skin tone, I mixed up an even lighter version of the skin tone wash to paint my husband's skin. He is a redhead, so he's pretty pale, and I mean, let's face it, I'm really pale too, so that's saying something. But I just basically did the same mixture with just more water for his skin tone, and then just kind of blending out some of those colors and where I put in the shadows just to kind of make it a little bit less harsh. So after painting the skin I mixed up some hair colors. So I kind of started with my light brown color and just mixed the browns basically that I have in my palette. So it's burnt sienna and burnt umber, and just kind of mix that to create this slightly darker brown, not as reddish as just burnt sienna. And I just kind of dab that color in. The lines that I had already drawn in with the Sharpie are really what makes the detail in the hair, not the painting for this one. So I just really had to dab in that color. And then for my husband's hair, I think I just added a little bit of orange and maybe some pink to kind of warm it up to take it more toward that auburn red color that he has and just give it a little bit of a distinction from the color of my hair. And you know, it's pretty similar. His is just on the red side. After that, I did the flowers. I did dab in some kind of deep red on some of them, and the other ones were just white. So I left those plain or with just the color of the paper. And this, it's a little bit hard to see because when I did this drawing, I didn't have any of the true fine liners with me. I just had a fine point Sharpie, which is a little bit thick for such small details like those flowers. So it was a little bit harder. And then I did dab in a little bit of green around the red as well. But again, it's just kind of hard to see, especially on the video. It's a little bit easier in person. So then I just tapped in a little bit basically of the hair color, but brown, on my husband's tie. He was wearing a brown tie for the wedding. After that, I went for the background and the foreground water. So there isn't any sky in this picture, it's top down, and so we're standing on this dock and the whole background is just water and the foreground. So I used my mop brush to just wet the whole background carefully around the figures and around the dock, just so that it wouldn't bleed onto them. And I did this because I wanted to get a nice wet on wet blend. Having trouble with the words, but just get a nice wet on wet look for the water, because water is kind of soft. It doesn't have hard edges at all. So go ahead and wet it all up. So then I start going in with just some blue color. Not really sure why I'm using such a small brush for this at this point. It would have been easier and quicker to use a larger brush, but I think I just stuck with the same brush that I was using for the rest of the painting, I guess. I don't know, maybe, you know, I forgot that my larger round brush was sitting there, but whatever, I just used this one. I guess it made it a little bit easier to go around the figures and around the dock, but especially easier than the mop brush. That's probably why I didn't use the mop brush, but I did have that larger round one sitting literally right next to my hand that I could have very easily used, and it has a nice point on it as well. So, you know, whatever, I just went with it. So I, again, am just painting that blue, trying to get a nice even wash basically around the background and then the foreground as well. I really, really like to see the paint bleed and blend smoothly with wet on wet technique in watercolor. I think that that was probably the most satisfying thing that I experienced when I switched, or not switched, but started playing with watercolors. When I had only done acrylics previously, you don't get that at all with acrylics. So I really like that soft bleed. If you enjoy that part of watercolor as well, hit the thumbs up button on this video. So I'm just adding in just a tiny bit of a deeper color or a deeper value here closer to the dock, just to show that there's a little bit of variety in the water. It's not all just one perfect color, so it's almost like a gradient at this point, but it's super, super subtle. And again, that wet on wet is going to make it bleed out and blend smoothly. And then I'm kind of forcing that too and picking up a little bit of the color here with the mop brush. So after getting that fairly even wash, I started the reflection in the shadowy area of the water. So I did continue to use wet on wet technique because that reflection doesn't have any sharp edges. So I wanted that soft blending out as well. And I did go in with the mop brush again just to get a little bit more water because it had started to dry on the page while I was painting the top part. Probably because I was using that tiny brush, you know. Again, should have used a bigger brush, but that's okay. So after I filled that in, I was initially kind of going around the figures because I don't know why. I was thinking, I guess maybe I would make them like match our colors, but then I realized that that didn't really make sense. And looking at the picture, it didn't make sense. So I just went over that whole front part and again got kind of an even wash. And then I go in with the darker color and add in the reflection shadowy area under the dock. And I'm tilting that page up just so that it can kind of bleed down the page a little bit, and still doing wet on wet, just so again there's no sharp edges. And then after I did it, it kind of dotted in, I kind of dotted in some color where the reflection of the figures are and continued to let it bleed down. And then it bled too much, so I just kind of dry off my brush and pick up some of that color. And that's the nice part about watercolor also, is that while it's still wet, you can manipulate it and kind of lift out a lot of that color as you go, so that, you know, as long as you're, I guess, quick enough, you can kind of fix mistakes a little bit. So I continued to add more layers here of slightly more pigmented paint, just to have a little bit of a darker value and build up that depth and kind of get the darker shadowy reflection closer up to the dock where it's less sun underneath it, and then just kind of, again, still let it bleed out toward the edge and kind of drag that color down with my brush without adding more pigment to it, just to get that soft kind of gradient. And then add a little bit more to where the figures are, because we casted a shadow kind of on the water, so adding in that kind of distinction there. And then just added some wiggles just to show some movement in the water, but it was really too wet at that point to really work how I envisioned it working. But still, that slight subtle difference in where the figures are and where the shadow is casted and the areas just to the right and left of it, it does add a little bit, I think. So while I let that dry, because it's very wet, I painted in my husband's black suit, and basically I was just trying to get some very concentrated paint there. The suit was really mostly black. There wasn't a ton of highlight on it, or shadows, just because it was black. So go in with that pretty concentrated, just straight black from my watercolor set. And at first I kind of forgot his arm, so I had to kind of remember and go back and do his arm. And then my camera froze. And so I did not get the video of me painting the dock. But, you know, I'm keeping it real here. I'm kind of a mess when it comes to this. Sometimes I don't know. I don't charge it all the way, or really the problem is I don't notice sometimes when it dies or freezes. But, you know, it happens. The dock was pretty easy, just some uneven kind of brown for the boards and then green for the edges. The line work really does all the job here, and the color just adds interest, context, and a little bit of depth with some shadow. I feel like I was really able to capture our postures well within this sketch, and so I think that's what really captured the feel of it and made me really happy with the outcome. If you like this video, check out how I got here to being able to do this with the videos on my portrait playlist. It shows my progress there. So thanks so much for watching.